Check. Okay. Thanks for being here this week. I want to apologize for having to postpone last week or 2 weeks ago. No, last week. My numbers are mixed up. An hour before I was set to leave last week, everything that I had prepared for what would have been last week's session vanished completely off my computer. And so I didn't figure it was fair to either of us to try to force something with the hour that I had to try to prepare stuff. So, but we're back now, and this week we're on the third and final week of our series about some of the most important peoples and states of the early Middle Ages, and we're taking a look now at the Vikings. And I would contend that of all of both the ancient and the medieval people that we could cover or that have some presence in pop culture today, none of them are as grossly misunderstood as the Vikings are. So I want to take some time tonight to dispel some of the more popular myths surrounding the Vikings, explain a bit about what they were like in everyday life, take a look at the relatively brief Viking age, as it's called, roughly 793 to about 1066, and then apply all of that to how the Vikings relate to the church. So before we dig into exactly who the Vikings were, I think it's important to first look at who they were not. The term Viking in itself isn't even a name. There's no tribe called the Vikings. There's no group called the Vikings. The term Viking is a title or a description of an activity that people undertook. If you were going Viking, you were joining up with others of your clan or perhaps another clan to head out from home and sail out on an expedition, maybe to explore, maybe to trade, maybe to raid. These were not, as we might think, exclusively or even often necessarily expeditions to go raiding and pillaging. These were predominantly for the purposes of trading and sailing to other countries, maybe to become mercenaries. They also weren't even called Vikings. before about 1070 or so. Before that time, they went by many different names, by many different people all across Europe. The Germans called them the Ashmen because their ships were made out of ash wood. The Irish called them the dark and fair foreigners. The Gaels in Scotland called them the people from the land of lakes, which makes sense because many of them were from Sweden, and there's about 100,000 lakes in Sweden. The Frisians in what's now the Netherlands called them the Northmen, so that's where we get that name from. And our friends, the Anglo-Saxons from last week, just called them the Danes, which is an oversimplification. They weren't all from Denmark, but that's what they were called in England. A better name for these people would be the Norse, since the languages they spoke were different parts of the Old Norse family of languages. I'll continue to call them the Vikings tonight, just for the sake of clarity, but just know that Norse or Norsemen better befits these groups of people. The Vikings were also not one single people group. What we know as the Vikings today were groups from many different clans that all came from predominantly 3 places. And you can see here on the map, in the darkest red there is where the first Vikings came from. Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. And despite how close you can see Finland is to all of these countries, Finland did not produce any Vikings. The Vikings certainly did not have any horned helmets, as a certain sports team might lead you to believe. They did not solely exist, as I said, to make war and raid and pillage and plunder. While they did do some things to perhaps earn that reputation, largely this comes about as a notion from Christian writers at the time who really didn't have the full picture of who these people were and didn't really care to get to know them because as far as they were concerned, they were bloodthirsty heathens. They were not also always ferocious warriors who were skilled in battle. The majority of them were farmers or fishermen. We've also seen elements of Norse mythology pop up in popular culture, most famously in the Marvel movies about Thor and whatnot, though I will say somewhere between 75 and 90% of what you see in pop culture in general about Vikings is either entirely wrong or only partially right at best. These movies are a good example. If you like the Thor movies, Thor and Loki aren't brothers, just so that you know that. And I could go on and on and on about all these different ways in which there's these myths that we need to dispel, but instead we'll just dive into who the Vikings were. First and foremost, as I mentioned before, they were not exclusively plundering raiders, despite what people at the time or people now may think. They didn't solely exist to land their ships near settlements, burn them down, and carry off loot and slaves. They did do those things. That's without question. They did do all of those things. But that was not the focal point of their existence. And trading and becoming mercenaries elsewhere were also not the focal point of their existence. The truth is that there's no one reason why these people from Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, all these different groups, there's no one reason why they all left their homes and sailed abroad to seek fortune in new lands. It's a combination of reasons. There's evidence to suggest, for example, that there was a population boom during the 700s, right before the beginning of the Viking Age in 793. This would have made agriculture very difficult. The agricultural capacity of the land would not have been enough to keep up with the increasing population. So as a result, many people, many young unmarried men found themselves with essentially nothing. They weren't landed in any way. They didn't have a wife. They didn't have a family. And so to remedy this, these landless men took to trade and piracy to obtain material wealth. There's also some evidence that many Norse pagans were violently angry at Charlemagne for, if you can remember, his forced Christianization policy, Christianization under pain of death, and many of them may have wanted revenge. There's also evidence that just before the Viking Age began, power in Scandinavia which had traditionally been dispersed among dozens, if not maybe almost into the hundreds of different chieftains and warlords, began to consolidate under the headship of just a few different kings or chieftains. And so this would have forced all these others that were not landed and in power now from their lands, which were then being slowly eaten up by these kings and these dynasties that were beginning to emerge. And so as a result, many of these chiefs and these warlords sought refuge elsewhere. There's also evidence of both a strong desire to take a greater role in the whole trade economy of Europe, and then also of just their own technological advances, particularly in shipbuilding, that would have allowed them to sail much further and longer than before. So there's a number of reasons as to why all of these different peoples began to spread from Scandinavia, really all at the same time, not within much of a time difference between them at all. And actually, I found this map. The text is hard to see, but every colored country is a country that was either settled in or raided by the Vikings. And yes, that includes Canada and Greenland. It does not include all of Russia, but they did make it to Russia. But that was the extent of their influence, all of that color there. And this period becomes known as the Viking Age, a time in which Norse sailors and explorers sack much of Europe, trade with states as far away as the Middle East and beyond the Black Sea, and discover new lands to the west. As you may remember from when we looked at the Anglo-Saxons, the Vikings first explode onto the scene in 793 on the Northumbrian island of Lindisfarne, where the monastery was, and they destroyed the monastery and killed most of the monks and looted everything. And that most certainly left Europe with an attitude of fear and hatred toward them. This is, I guess, best encapsulated in the words of a scholar on Charlemagne's court who was from Northumbria. And you may remember this from when we talked about the Anglo-Saxons. Never before has such terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race. The heathens poured out the blood of saints around the altar and trampled on the bodies of saints in the temple of God, like dung on the streets. And that pretty much became most of Europe's attitude toward the Vikings. And in small ways, and maybe in a few big ways, that sentiment does still carry on to the present day. From there, Vikings sacked much of the rest of Europe. They sacked all of the British Isles, England and Scotland and Ireland, much of northern Europe and into Russia, Germany, Italy, Spain, Portugal, and especially France. It was worst in France because they were able to enter the English Channel and then sail down the Seine into the heart of France and attack all of the cities that were along the river. And none of those were more noteworthy than Paris. Paris was sacked twice by the Vikings in a span of 40 years. Once in 845 and then again in 885. The attack in 845 actually came on Easter Sunday as the churches were filled with people. So these raids against the Franks and the Frankish Empire were so severe that Charlemagne basically had to buy them off, to pay them off to stop them from attacking. He gave them the region of Normandy in the northwest in exchange for ending the attacks, and the leader of the Vikings, named Rollo, converting to Christianity. As a side note, if you remember talking about the Anglo-Saxons and at the end of that how England was invaded by the Normans, these are the beginnings of the Normans. Rollo becomes the first king of Normandy, and his descendants, if you recall, go on to invade England, and they usher in almost 500 years of fighting for first the throne of England and then eventually the throne of both England and France, between England and France. Contrary to popular belief, though, Vikings were not all savage fighters and bloodlusting creatures by trade or habit. They rarely had armor or swords. Most of them, as I said, were often farmers or fishermen. Swords and armor were expensive to make, and they were rare for a non-noble person to own. So generally, only noblemen, the jarls as they were called, the highest level of society, would have something like a sword or a full set of armor. So usually, the average soldier went into battle with just a helmet, a shield, and an axe or a spear. As I said, the Vikings were not just primarily raiders. They were also, perhaps primarily, traders. And pull it here. This is a map of trade routes run by the Vikings. Every line that you see is a route run by the Vikings, whether it be by land or sea. Trade routes from Scandinavia spread all across Europe and well beyond that, as far as Constantinople, Baghdad in Iraq, the Caspian Sea, and even indirectly through the Silk Road with the Far East and China. From these lands came into Scandinavia for the first time luxury imports like large amounts of silver, silk, weapons unlike anything that the Vikings had made before, wine, ware, stones for grinding grain, textiles, pottery, slaves from different parts of the world. The Norse peoples themselves did export things like honey, tin, wheat, wool, various furs and hides, feathers, falcons, whalebone, walrus ivory, reindeer antler, and amber was the big one. The most significant trade partners for the Vikings were the various Muslim caliphates in the east. And we know this because all across Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and also the British Isles, all of England, Ireland, and Scotland, we find hordes of silver coins stamped with the seals of Islamic states and Muslim rulers. Over 150,000 silver Arab dirhams, their coin, have been found in Sweden alone. And so I found some pictures of just some of the many hoards that have been come across that I wanted to show you. These are some examples of some of the things that these Vikings would hoard. They would go and trade what they had to export and then bring back all of these silver goods. This is one example. This is another. All of these are coins, by the way. This is another. This is one of the largest Viking hoards that had ever been found. And we'll never actually know how many coins specifically that the Vikings brought back, because more often than not, they actually melted them down and repurposed them. Because, the reason we find them in hoards, as opposed to just having been used as currency in Scandinavia, is because the Vikings didn't really use coins for trade. They, by and large, had a barter economy with metal bullion. They used precious metals, like gold and silver, but these were most often in the form of ingots or bars, particularly of silver, because silver was more valuable to them than gold, actually. And it was not just silver coins that they hoarded, as you could see. They're just a few of the hundreds of hoards that have been uncovered. We can see that they were quite the traders and quite the hoarders. Whether that was coins, bracelets, metal jars, just all sorts of different things. But just as valuable to them as silver were slaves. Viking traders from all across were gather slaves from all across Europe, and they traded them with Muslims in the East, because there was, for whatever reason, high demand in the East for European slaves. But they also traded for their own slaves from the Arab world and North Africa. Slaves in Scandinavia were known as thralls. They were the lowest level of society. But at one point, as much as 10% of the population of Scandinavia as a whole may have been comprised entirely of thralls. Some have argued that actually the desire for slaves was one of the sparks or the motivations behind the initial Viking expansion. That's not a consensus opinion by any means, but some have suggested that. Because slaves were a commodity. They were valuable both from a monetary perspective, but also from a labor perspective in the East and then also among the Vikings. One of the strongest motivations to take slaves may have been, at least for the Vikings, to bring more women into the North. Because for many years, many of the clans had practiced infanticide, and they had weeded out girls in favor of boys. And this eventually, as you would imagine, began to take a toll on the split in their society between males and females. Several scores of young men went unmarried for the rest of their lives because there weren't enough women for them to marry. And many Viking raids, rather than gathering plunder per se, were targeting women and girls from places like the British Isles, the Mediterranean, both Western and Eastern Europe. But this was not just so that there'd be more females to marry and have kids with. Women were also very valuable in the trade world as well, because quite often, if you look at just the general context of history, women are taken as slaves because in a lot of societies, they are traditionally the people who produce the high-quality goods. Maybe not entirely, but by and large. You might think that if you wanted captives for labor, maybe for hard labor you would want men, but for skilled labor you might want women instead. Textile working, particularly, was associated with women in Scandinavia. But all that to say that despite their historical reputation, the Vikings were much more often better traders than they were raiders. Here, I'll actually meant to show you that. This is, if you can see it, an example of a textile pattern woven and found in Scandinavia. It matches patterns from the area, so we assume that it's from there. But yes, this is an example of some of the fine textile work you could see from Scandinavian women. Beyond raiding and trading, though, the two things that the Vikings should best be known for are exploration and settling. See, the reason why the Viking Age was so short, and the reason why you don't see the remains of huge Viking cities in Scandinavia, is because wherever the Vikings settled, they almost immediately began to intermingle with the local population. They still had their distinct way of life, but as they began to mix with the local populations around them, their neighbors, particularly as these Scandinavian peoples became Christianized, it became easier for the Vikings to sort of meld into the places where they lived until they just became another part of the local identity. And that's generally true everywhere. In England, they integrated well into Anglo-Saxon culture. In France, they assimilated into Frankish culture. In Russia, they merged with the Slavic tribes. Everywhere they went, they eventually melted away into being part of the local cultures. That doesn't mean, though, that they didn't rub off on the local cultures, though. A great example of that, I think, maybe the best example, at least that I can think of, is how Old Norse words made it into the English language. There's over 1,000 words present in English today that are originally from Old Norse. Numerous places, for example, in the east and northeast of England, still today have Danish names. And many personal names in the English language are of Scandinavian origin. Even the names for the days of the week, by and large, come from the Old Norse. And I want to show you what that looks like here. If I can get it. Yes. Monday. We start with Monday. Monday was Moon's Day, Mánadagur, named after the personification of the moon, Mani. Tuesday was Týrsdagur, or Tears Day, after one of the most important Norse gods. Wednesday for the Norse was Odin's Dagur, or Odin's Day. And when this went into Anglo-Saxon, because their Odin was known as Woden, it became Woden's Dagur. Thursday is Thor's Dagur, Thor's Day. Friday was Freya for the Norse, or Freya's Day, and then when that became part of English, it went to associating with their old pagan goddess, Frigg, and so it became Frigdaga, Friday. And then Sunday is Sunundagur, Suna's Day, Suna being the opposite of Mani, the personification of the sun. Only Saturday doesn't come from Old Norse. That is Saturn's Day. That's believed to be a holdover from old Roman Britain there in Anglo-Saxon England, Saturn being the Roman god of agriculture. And as neat as those are, let's just look at some other examples of some words from the Old Norse that have made it into English. Anger, anger in Old Norse. Birth is from Old Norse. Byrður. Die, deja. Egg is just egg. It just comes straight across. Gosling, a baby goose. Gaislinger. Knife, knot, link, mistake. Pretty straightforward, that one. Mistaka. Plow would have been ploger. Reindeer, if you can see how close that is, reindeer. Root came from rot. Seat came from sati. Then these three here, they, there, thrust is just one, but anything with a th, being thair or thera, or with thrust, thrista. Wand, weak, there's, again, over 1,000 words. But the three in particular there, just as an interesting little tidbit, that start with th. They have that weird letter that you don't recognize necessarily. And that is this letter, on the left capitalized, on the right lowercase. This is actually the lost 27th letter of the English alphabet, the letter thorn, as it was called. For many, many centuries, all the way up into early modern English even, the th sound used to have a letter attached to it, and that was this letter thorn. So why don't we have this letter today? You know, you've maybe never seen this before. You've only ever known 26 letters in the alphabet. Why isn't this here today if it existed for so long? Geography. Up until the 1400s, the letter thorn was used to represent the th sound in almost anything you would find in the English language. And then in 1439, a German goldsmith by the name of Johannes Gutenberg changed the world and changed the movement of information itself. He invented movable print, which in effect allowed for the invention of the printing press. And if you remember Gutenberg, what we know him, I guess, if you know of his name, it's probably for Gutenberg's Bible. The first thing he did print on the printing press was the King James Bible. With the speed, though, of this printing press, information spreads rapidly. It's very easy to spread information now, really for the first time in history. But because Gutenberg was German, logically, most of the people who came to him and started, to learn under him and then become printers themselves were German themselves. And so most of the first printing presses started up in Germany. But if you look at the German language, then and then also now, not only is there not an equivalent for the letter thorn, the th sound doesn't exist at all in German. This is why, and if you'll hear this and you'll get it right away. When you hear a German speaking English, they don't, for example, they don't think, they sink. They don't throw, they throw. The TH sound always is dropped in favor of an S or a Z. So when people from England, once this printing press started running, would give their documents to German printers to make copies of them, for the Germans, this random letter kept popping up, and they didn't know what it was. They had no frame of reference for this. And so because they didn't have this letter, by extension, they didn't have the metal piece necessary in the movable print process to print that letter in ink onto a document. It was not possible for them to reproduce it. And because they were smart enough to know they shouldn't just leave this letter out, they replaced it with what they thought was the next best thing, the letter Y, because to them, it just looked kind of similar. So, for example, when you see a sign or a place name, whether it's in this country or in England or whatnot, that says ye old something, it says ye because it doesn't say the. The English didn't just say ye. The Germans just didn't have the right letter for it. More importantly, this is where the words you, your, anything starting with a Y in place of a TH comes from. The Y replaces the thorn. And then later in time, when a word like thy or worthy, something that, if you have the TH and the Y together, it just doesn't make sense. The TH was added to these words later in English before the Y so that English readers would understand what the Y was for. And then eventually that just became how you pronounced it with a Y at the end of these things. And so that, in a nutshell, is how the 27th letter of the alphabet died. And at the very, very beginning of it, we have the Vikings to thank for the letter in the first place. Life is very, very strange like that. But I came across that in prep, and I couldn't just not tell you that. So I think we'll go ahead and take a break now. We'll come back at 7:10. And we are back. As I said before, or I've said this really this whole time, the Vikings were traders, they were raiders, they were settlers, and they were also tremendous explorers. As they left home and set out in search of new lands in which to settle, many did go to the British Isles and to mainland Europe, but some went beyond that. The Vikings were masters of sailing. And at this time, at least in the Western world, they had perhaps the most advanced ships in the world. This picture is not size-wise, but in image, what the average Viking ship may have looked like during the Viking Age. This is actually, at a museum in Denmark, this is the largest Viking ship ever discovered. It never actually sailed. It was found in a ship burial, but it is still a Viking ship. 71 feet long, 17 feet wide. The mast there is about 33 feet high. And the sail, which is not there now, but the sail that it would have had probably would have been about 970 square feet in size. So if this had sailed, it would have been enormous on the seas. But by 874, Vikings had discovered and settled in Iceland. And they would go on to eventually become the ancestors of modern Iceland and the modern Icelandic language. Even today, if you look at the Old Norse language and then you look at the modern Icelandic language, Icelandic is really as close as you can get in the modern day to resembling what the Old Norse did. It's different, but it's very similar to that, to the extent that a lot of Icelanders today can read old manuscripts in Old Norse because there's that much intelligibility between them. By the 980s, the Vikings had gone past Iceland and they had made it to Greenland. Greenland, this picture here. This picture is of Valsey Church. It's the best preserved ruin of Viking settlements still left in Greenland. And it's also the site of the last written record of Viking settlers in Greenland, which was a wedding in the early 1400s. The problem with Greenland was that even though it's called Greenland, we all know that it's not so much. And the soils there were far too poor to farm. And then the distance between it and even Iceland, let alone the rest of Scandinavia or Europe, just made it seem logical to the settlers there to leave, to not stay forever. And they eventually were all gone by the early 1400s. And by the year 1000, if you didn't already know it, the Vikings beat Christopher Columbus to the punch and discovered America. And we have other evidence to support the idea that Vikings made it to North America. Archaeologically, but then also in written evidence, particularly in two texts that are called the Vinland sagas. The Vinland sagas are named after a place that they called Vinland. Vinland was the name of a place discovered by the Norse explorer Leif Erikson in the early 1000s. And the name Vinland means literally wine land. And the story at least goes that the reason why it's called Vinland is because when Leif Erikson landed in Vinland, he discovered grape vines. And the Vinland sagas, they're not just made-up stories. They actually go into great and very accurate detail about the topography of where they landed, the natural resources there, and the native cultures that the Vikings encountered when they were there. And better still, they even settled down there for a time. Well, down there, I should say up there from where we're at. It was in Canada after all. They settled at a place that's called Las Almedos now. It was not called that then. In the 60s, on the northernmost tip of Newfoundland, which is off the eastern coast of Canada, archaeologists found the remains of this settlement, which was very clearly, given the way that the buildings were built and some of the artifacts that they found, a Norse settlement. The remains of 8 buildings total were found, all of which were constructed of sod placed over a wood frame. The largest of them, when they first found it, was almost 100 feet long and about 50 feet wide. Some of the artifacts that have been found there suggested that they had their own blacksmith, their own carpenter that they brought with them, and they also found things like knitting needles, spindles, a loom, which at that time, given how society worked for them, would have suggested that women came with them as well. Most important there at Lansel Meadows was the discovery of butternuts, and not butternut squash. Butternuts are a type of walnut. This is actually important because butternuts don't grow anywhere within 600 miles of this spot in Newfoundland. The closest they grow is 600 miles south in New Brunswick, which is another Canadian province. And so this obviously has to suggest that these explorers went even further than the northern tip of Newfoundland, almost into mainland Canada itself. Eventually, though, this settlement, like the ones in Greenland, was abandoned. But this has been worked on. This is not the 100% original, but it is largely the original. Some of the buildings are not still standing, but what remains is largely original. This is tangible proof that almost 500 years before Columbus sailed the ocean blue, Vikings landed in North America. Beyond, though, their trading and their raiding and their exploring and their settling, the Vikings were perhaps the reason that Christian Europe was most confused about the Vikings is because they couldn't understand where, in their minds, these barrel-chested, armor-clad warriors who fought like demons came from. What made them fight anyone at all? What was their motivation? And all that boils down to their worldview. And that worldview comes from Norse mythology. I promise it won't sound like it, at least at first, but I'm not going to be diving too deeply into this subject. I really just want to briefly hit on it because it is important both to understanding where these pagan people were coming from, but then also how these practices of theirs continue to affect them even after they convert to Christianity. And it should also help clear up a lot of the bunk that people believe today about Norse mythology, especially if you like Thor movies that Marvel put out. I mean, those are an atrocious show of scattered mythology that almost none of which is real. And if all this is new information, if you didn't even know the Norse had mythology, know that this really, I promise, is a very broad overview. And if you're interested, do some research on it later. We get almost everything we know about Old Norse mythology from 2 sources: the Prose Edda and the Poetic Edda, which were both written in the 1200s in Iceland by Christian authors, one of whom was anonymous. The other was a man named Snorri Sturluson. And they were not, as I said, they were Christians. They were not writing this for their own good. They were documenting the old beliefs of those that had come before them for the benefit of posterity, essentially. At the center of the Norse universe, and you can see it here, is Yggdrasil, the world tree. And the branches of the world tree connect to the 9 realms or the 9 worlds of Norse mythology. The world we live in is Midgard. You can see it in green there, close to the middle. And this is the realm of humans. For the Vikings, they have gods and goddesses, and there are 2 groups of them. The more powerful are the Aesir, and the less powerful are the Vanir. Some of the best known that maybe you've heard of before would include Odin, or in Old Norse, Odin, who is obsessed with obtaining knowledge and who sends out his ravens, Hugin and Munin, which in Old Norse are literally thought and memory, all across the world collecting information to bring back to Odin. This is actually, I just found a random picture. If you can look close, you can see Odin's ravens with him. He is on his 8-legged horse, Sleipnir, And he has his spear, Gungnir, there by his side. And Odin is so obsessed with it, collecting information and prophecies that he, at one point, plucks out his own eye in one story in pursuit of the obtaining of knowledge. We also have Thor, the son of Odin, the wielder with great strength of the hammer Mjolnir. And while he was a strong guy, perhaps the favorite god of the Norse peoples in general, he's kind of a clown, kind of a bonehead. If you read the stories in the Eddas, he's not the smartest guy. He's a strong guy. He's quite a warrior, but he's not the smartest guy. And if you can see really closely, he's fighting the giants, and he's riding in a chariot, his chariot, pulled by goats. You'll find this theme a lot with Norse gods and goddesses. They ride in chariots pulled by strange things. Odin's wife Freya actually rides in a chariot pulled by cats. We also have Loki, who is almost not anything like the Marvel movies suggest. And that's not the greatest picture, but sort of a mischievous trickster who actually ends up bringing about the end of the world. And Freya, the wife of Odin, who is not actually of the Aesir, she was the Vanir. And then Balder. Balder, the second son of Odin, the beautiful son of Odin, as he was known to the gods and goddesses, who dies by the trickery of Loki. And his death was prophesied to mark the beginning of Ragnarok. Ragnarok being the end of the world. The Norse, though, are a lot like the ancient Greeks in that, and really the Romans as well, in that their gods and goddesses, they're not necessarily anything other than people with superpowers, to put it one way. They all have emotions and problems and affairs, just like the Greek and Roman deities. But unlike them, and contrary to what we're popularly told, none of these gods or goddesses are the god of or the goddess of something. They don't have that kind of role. In other words, they don't generally have one or two things that they're sort of in charge of. So if you've seen the Thor movies, Thor is not the god of thunder. Loki is not explicitly the trickster god, and so on. Thor is the closest you see in Norse mythology to being directly over elements. His name, Thor, means thunder. The name of his hammer, Mjolnir, means lightning. And it's possible that at one point he was associated with those elements, but the way that the writings present themselves, when it comes to Thor or anyone else, it's more about their personalities, what they're like as beings, rather than their roles over things. They're not really these elemental forces like a god of thunder, or god of fire, or god of war, or whatever, so much as they are portrayed by their personal attributes. So Thor is known as being very honest, Odin is very wise, Loki is very mischievous, and so on and so forth. The Norse, like many other mythologies, also had things like giants, the Jotun, as they were called, who, confusingly enough, aren't all giant-sized, but are still called giants for some reason. They had elves, good elves and bad elves, dwarves, and realms of fire and ice, Muspelheim and Helheim. That last one, Helheim, the realm of Hel, a daughter of Loki who presides over a portion of the dead. That word Hel goes into English and becomes our word hell. And as we know, ironically, our hell is not icy like that hell. We know that. For the Norse Vikings, though, everything about their religion, and really everything about their lives, their worldview, the decisions that they make in combat or just at home, centers around the coming of Ragnarok, which is the end of not just the world, but really of all things almost. The events of Ragnarok are unique because unlike how we understand the end of this world, with God reigning triumphant and being worshipped in the New Jerusalem, almost all of the gods and goddesses of the Norse myth die during Ragnarok. The Vikings are a people who, depending on the source you read, don't have any transcendent future to look forward to past a certain point, because they and nearly all of their gods will perish eternally. For a time, there is something to look forward to. Those who die in glorious battle and with honor go to Valhalla, which is the hall of Odin in Asgard. But they go there not because that's just what heaven looks like for them. They go there because Odin brings them there. Odin is gathering as many warriors to himself as possible for the battles ahead. And the reason Odin is obsessed with obtaining knowledge and wisdom, and particularly prophecies, is because he is desperately at all times trying to stave off his death and the death of the gods during Ragnarok. Odin himself, for example, does die, and he is prophesied to be swallowed whole and alive by the giant wolf Fenrir, who is actually a son of Loki, by the way. Thor will do battle with Jormungandr, the world serpent, who is so big, and this picture doesn't necessarily do it justice, but is so big that it wraps around all of Midgard, all of Earth. And even though he wins and he slays the serpent, it is so venomous that he can only take 9 steps before he dies. Loki does battle with the god Heimdall, and both of them die. Vidar, another son of Odin, avenges his father by splitting Fenrir in two. And then after all this happens, the fire giant, Surtur, lights the world on fire. And it burns continuously until a flood comes and eventually puts it all out. A small handful of gods do survive. And only 2 humans, Leif and Leifrasir, survive. And they are tasked with rebuilding the world and the human race. And I'm sure you can probably see the parallels there to Adam and Eve. This is not where Adam and Eve come from, obviously, but there are the parallels there. So for the Vikings, there's great motivation to die honorably on the field of battle so that they can be carried by the Valkyries to Valhalla and eventually fight in the service of Odin at Ragnarok. And this is the ultimate reason behind this fierce fighting reputation that these peoples gained throughout all of their conquests in Europe and the Near East and such. And that ties in directly to how the Vikings relate to the church. The Vikings first come into contact with Christianity through raids, not through missionaries, through raids. And when they would go on to settle in lands of the Christian population, since Jesus to these pagans was just another god to adopt, they accepted or adopted Christianity, at least in word, quite quickly. This was true first in Normandy, then later in Ireland, throughout the British Isles. And although accounts from the time don't say much about it, we see it in the archaeological evidence. Norse pagans for centuries had buried their dead with grave goods, things like weapons and close pets. For the rich, sometimes even their slaves were put to death with them and then buried with them. But Christians didn't bury their dead with grave goods. And so this is how we can see the transition from paganism to Christianity. And as well as their conversion abroad in the places where they settled, the Viking Age also sees a gradual conversion of Scandinavia itself, as Anglo-Saxon and then German missionaries arrived to convert the pagans. By the mid-1000s, Christianity was well established in both Denmark and then also, especially so, in Norway. And even though it took a little bit, by the mid-12th century, Sweden was Christianized as well. And so as this conversion process starts to go along, you see Christians, for example, start to take over the traditional pagan sites. A good example of this is in Sweden, where the remains of an early church stand alongside a number of huge pagan burial mounds. We also see in the written record that sites of sacred trees, which in Norse mythology and then just in general Germanic mythology, the idea of a sacred tree was quite common. And these were either destroyed or replaced with churches. We see writing start to come to Scandinavia, really for the first time, organized writing, because even though the Norsemen had runes with which they made short inscriptions on weapons or stones or whatnot, they didn't have a writing system. They weren't a literate people yet. And yet, even as they accepted Christianity, traces of old Norse paganism remained in the cultures of these various Scandinavian peoples. One great example, Thor's hammer. These are pendants recovered from Sweden of Thor's hammer. These were still very commonly worn, and oftentimes they were either mistaken for or claimed to be Christian crosses. Obviously, that is not a full cross, so we don't have to buy that. But well past the end of paganism, they still wore Thor's hammer. The Yule festival, the pagan Yule festival, around the time of Christian Christmas, was still celebrated, even though it was rehashed in Christian terms. Parents and grandparents still told their children folk tales of giants and trolls, elves, dwarves, gnomes, fairies, things of Old Norse myth that were not endorsed by the church. Many people, if you can wrap your mind around it, it's still hard for me sometimes, still ate horse meat. Because at this time, horse meat was, even though it was prohibited by the church, was very popular because people associated horses with Odin's horse, Sleipnir. But even though some people, continued these practices and went beyond that and actually still worshiped the old gods in secret, Scandinavia was by far and away almost fully Christianized by the end of the 14th century, the 1300s. As far as how Christians outside the Norse sphere were affected by the Vikings, so Christians in Europe and broader, most of our non-Norse primary sources on the Vikings were written by members of the clergy, church members. And they wrote from a Christian perspective on the events of Norse mythology and their gods and their practices and so on. And so for a while example, these pagan Norsemen believed that fate governed all things. We, Christians, believe that God governed all things. And so it was a tremendous blow to Christians and to Christian Europe when the seemingly invincible Vikings sacked and desecrated churches, really with impunity. Many people concluded, as has been concluded many times throughout the history of the church, that God was using the Vikings to punish the church for some as yet unidentified sin. In a material sense, though, in a military sense, I guess, this does not help anyone in the short term, because every Viking victory over any of the states of Europe, the Christian states of Europe, undermines their confidence. Instead of trying to learn from their strategic blunders and get better at fighting these fierce northerners, some leaders concluded they just needed to pray and undergo supplication more, and then became increasingly depressed when they lost the next battle anyway, despite how much they prayed. And so early on, the Vikings, when they were fighting against the Christians, achieved a very strong psychological edge over the armies of the Christians that they were fighting. And it wasn't until the Christians started to rack up some victories, which is really almost a generation after the start of Norse Christianization, that the Christians started to clear their head and start to solve the Viking problem. Gradually, the disdain, there we go, that the early Vikings had for Christianity starts to shift. One of the reasons is that as Christians began to win battles and earn the respect of their Viking enemies, guys like Alfred the Great in England, Charlemagne in France, King Constantine in Scotland, they devised strategies that broke the spell of Viking invincibility. And so the Vikings started to respect them for winning against them. And simultaneously to this, some clergymen who were somewhere between disgusted and just deathly afraid with their royal patron's inability to defend them, started leading forces themselves. Some of these bishops and abbots were originally from noble birth, and they had some military training, and they proved to be successful leaders. Monasteries, like some of the ones in Ireland, built towers to stave off Viking attacks. And men, like most notably Bishop Hammond of Wessex, fought and died heroically in battle against the Vikings. And the Vikings did notice this. And in their minds, they began to see that the Christian God was a God of war that they could better appreciate because of the success that he gave those who worshipped him. And so this more militant response to the Viking invasions was to have far-reaching and often actually negative effects on the church in the Middle Ages. And actually, in a neat aside, is one reason why a chessboard today has bishops as pieces in places of power. But of all the things that the Vikings encountered, what finally changed their mind about Christianity the most was the first contact they had with the Byzantine Empire, that is, the Eastern Roman Empire. Starting in the 9th century, Vikings from Sweden, and then the descendants of Vikings from the Kievan Rus, what we would know as Russia today, began to fight with, and then eventually began to fight for, Constantinople. Constantinople, by far, was the most magnificent city that any of these northerners had ever seen. It was, as we've talked about before, opulently wealthy, ridiculously wealthy. And the city alone, at the time, at least at the beginning of the 9th century, had more people than everyone in Sweden. It was also the first naval power that the Vikings encountered that could actually stand up to them and even stop them. The Heimskringla, which is a book on Swedish and Norwegian kings at this time, sums up the impression the Vikings had of what they called the Great City. Upon entering the gates for the first time of Constantinople, the Norwegian king, Harald Hardrada, tells his followers to close their gaping mouths, lest they look like fools. Later in the 10th century, the Byzantine Emperor Basil became known as the Bulgar Slayer from his campaigns against the Bulgars in Eastern Europe, instituted what became called the Varangian Guard, which was an elite unit specifically for the defense of the emperor of 6,000 Vikings. And while initially it was made up of Swedes and some from the Rus, the Varangian Guard soon starts to bring in Norse warriors from all over the Viking world. The brave men of ability, really is what it boiled down to, would distinguish their careers, ironically for these pagans, in the service of the Christian emperors, for the prestige, the glory, and then the wealth that it guaranteed. These men didn't only come home to Scandinavia with cash and stories to tell, but they just had a broader perspective of the world in general. And though the Viking Age would eventually end, as I said, in the mid to late 1000s, and this sort of warrior ethos of the Norse clans eventually cools, and Scandinavia becomes more like the rest of Europe, the Christian Vikings that you see in the 10th and the 11th centuries don't behave much differently than their pagan counterparts. They were still extraordinarily warlike and about as likely to plunder, take slaves, have multiple wives, engage in blood feuds, and display other typical features of Vikings anywhere. They were just as daring in exploration. Some of the most savage successful Vikings like Harold Hardrada, Citric Silkenbeard, Leif Erikson, Canute the Great. Yeah, people have some crazy names, by the way. Were Christians by choice. Viking values of total commitment in battle and placing glory over life itself also did not change. Clear evidence is found in two separate battles, one in Ireland and one actually at the Battle of Stamford Bridge against the Normans in England in 1066, featured Viking armies of different faiths, of paganism and Christianity, chose to be annihilated rather than suffer dishonor. They had casualty rates of something like 80 or 90%. So that was still present even with the Christian Vikings. So these battles, and then all the other ones like them, show that for the Vikings it didn't really matter whether they were going to heaven or Valhalla. Many early Viking Christians seem to have just incorporated Christ into their beliefs rather than completely rejecting the old ways. We find sayings in the sagas like, on land I worship Christ, but at sea I worship Thor. There are other examples of this too, such as a dying Rollo of Normandy, if you remember, gifts 100 pounds of gold to his local Christian churches, and then hangs 100 prisoners as sacrifices to Odin. One way to generalize it would be to say, as I read in one spot, that it usually took Vikings 2 or 3 generations just to figure out what monotheism was. And so this conflict between paganism and Christianity really becomes the defining feature, perhaps, of the Viking Age. Gradually, though, the Vikings begin to adopt Christianity. Their conscience changes, their worldview changes. Christianity doesn't end the Viking Age. It doesn't make the Vikings any less Viking. Some of the most epic battles fought by Vikings were fought by Christianized Vikings. But Christianity was recognized by both sides, the pagans and the church, as one of the clearest pathways to bringing the Norse peoples into the European community. Rulers in England and France and Constantinople used it to harness the energy of the Northerners. The Norse kings used it in their drive for power and nation building. So Christianity and then inclusion within the church, along with changing economic, military, political circumstances and the like, makes the Scandinavia of the 12th century very different from the Scandinavia of the 9th century. But focusing on too much on this delivers sort of an inaccurate picture. For most of the 3 centuries that the Vikings were exploring the oceans, trading with the far corners of the earth and fighting all comers against them, the Christians and the pagans amongst them were moving in and out of conflict and cooperation. Like Odin, like Thor, the Vikings didn't just have a fierce nature. Excuse me. They also had a curious one. And through both their old pagan faiths and their new Christian faiths, they find different ways to understand the world and different self-expression, I guess, through art and then also their action. And so that, oh no, I can't not show you that. One more tremendous example of the still continuing influence of the church in Scandinavia. These are the flags of all of the Scandinavian countries. You can count Finland in this because it has the same flag, but they're all crosses. The Faroe Islands there in the right corner belong to Denmark, by the way. But these are still their flags today and have been for centuries. But that draws our 3-part series to a close. Next week we will skip ahead just a smidge. Not really skip ahead, just by about 150 years or so. In total across the whole thing, to the Crusades, focusing on why they happened, how successful and then unsuccessful they were, and then their effect on both church history, but then also world history. And so until then, have a good night.